All right, so welcome back to part three of our series on externalities. This part is going to deal with exactly how to deal with what we call market failure. Now, market failure is going to be because this free market allocation and the socially efficient allocation, they're not the same. In other words, the amount that of quantity being traded in the market is different than what is socially optimal. Okay, so that's an inefficiency. So how do we fix this problem? Well, there's a few solutions. I say two and a half. One of them may not have too much of a reason to exist, but we'll see how that goes. The first is a public solution. So basically, this is where the government comes in and institute some sort of a law in order to try to correct this market failure. Now, an example is this Clean Air Act of 1970. So there's a negative production externality, and the government came in with this act in order to reduce pollution. So as a result, we see 1,300 fewer infants died in 1972 than would have died in the absence of the Clean Air Act, according to an article by Che and Greenstone. Okay, so what other types of mechanisms, other than just banning production, what sort of other mechanisms can we think of that the government could use in order to decrease the quantity of goods in the market? Well, if you said taxes, then you are right. So if we tax in the amount of the externality, and in our case, we're going to use an excise tax, just like we did in the taxes chapter. But if we tax in the amount of the externality, then we should be able to create a situation where the market outcome and the socially efficient outcome are the same. So let's see how that might work. Now, we've got an example here, so we kind of need to use what we learned in the prior chapter, in the prior video, to figure out exactly what situation we're in here. So I see that there's nothing really weird going on with demand. It's just a regular looking demand curve. So there's no externality for consumption, but I do see that this marginal private cost, that's our supply curve, is not the same as the marginal social cost. So the marginal private cost and marginal social cost is different. So we have a externality on production. Additionally, we can see that the market allocation, so when supply equals demand, that's greater than the efficient allocation. Okay, so in other words, we're producing too much. We want to produce less. We'll be better off if we produce less. Okay, so we've got a negative production externality. All right, so we want to produce less. We're going to use a tax in order to shift our supply curve, this marginal private cost curve. We're going to shift this curve such that supply equals demand at the efficient allocation. Okay, and that's going to happen. So basically, we want to move this this marginal private cost curve, this curve here, up such that it meets demand here, because this is the point. This is the point that the efficient allocation, this is the point of the efficient allocation. So if we want to shift this curve up such that they meet at this point, then we need to shift up in this exact amount. Okay, so in other words, how much is that going to be? Well, we go over here and we see 4. And if we go from here to here, we see this is 6. Okay, so in other words, we're going from 4 to 6. Okay, so that's a change of 2. That's a difference of 2. Okay, so in other words, we want to tax $2. Okay, so this, oops, wrong thing. We want to tax $2. Okay, and if we do that, this marginal private cost curve is going to shift up by 2. It'll be a parallel shift up of 2. Okay? And so we'll have marginal private cost plus this tax. Okay? And so our new supply equals demand, so our demand equals supply plus tax, rather, is going to occur right here. And that means that our new allocation, our new quantity, is the efficient one. Okay, so we've actually used this tax in order to make our market efficient. Okay, but what if we have some sort of a positive externality? So in this case, we've got a positive externality. Lift that up. So we've got a positive externality because quantities, the socially optimal quantity is greater than the market allocation. Okay, and what other type of externality is this? Well, this is going to be a consumption externality. We know it's a consumption externality because our marginal private benefit and our marginal social benefit, they are not the same. Okay, so in other words, there's something going on with the demand curve, consumption. Okay, so we want to increase the amount of production, and we want to increase our output here. So how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to do what's basically the opposite of a tax. So instead of instead of paying the government a couple of bucks per unit, we're going to get a couple of bucks per unit from the government. So this is what's called a subsidy. So we're going to think about this as the opposite of a tax in that sort of way. Okay, so what we've got here is we've got this marginal private cost, and we want, in other words, this is our supply curve, and we want this supply curve to equal the demand curve, this marginal private benefits curve, such that our outcome will be QS. Okay, so in other words, we want to shift this down. We want to shift this down such that this curve is this curve. Okay, so we need to shift this down in this amount. Okay, so we need a subsidy in that particular amount. I don't have any numbers for this particular slide, but it'd be the same thing as last time. Okay, so it'll just be the difference between those two. Okay, so in other words, we're going to have a subsidy if we want to increase production, increase output. We're going to have a tax if we want to decrease the output. Okay, so what are some problems that we may have with this type of allocation? Well, first of all, the government's got to know the damage of the externality. Okay, that may not be very easy. Okay, the government is in general, these types of things are political, and depending on affiliations and personal beliefs, whether or not something's a positive or negative externality may not be even something that's agreed on, let alone an exact amount, right? For example, what kind of externality do we think firearms have? Now, I'm not going to say what I think, but I can guarantee that people have disagreements on that. Okay, so if we can't agree on that, then having some sort of a fix is going to be difficult. Okay, we could also have private solutions. Okay, so in other words, if we came together and we were able to make some sort of an agreement on what to do, we might have some sort of a better solution there. So this example here, the doctor and the confectioner. So Ronald Coase, a Nobel Prize winning economist, came up with this story of the doctor and the confectioner. So I'll go over this story real quick. So the doctor and confectioner they work next to each other. So the doctor's got to practice next to this confectioner who's a candy maker. And the doctor's practice is going well, and he decides to get a new room so that he can consult patients in. So he builds a new room. And this room is closer than it was before to the candy maker. Now that he's closer, he can hear the machines that the candy maker is using. And they're a lot louder, and it's a lot tougher for him to be able to consult with his patients because of this machine. So the idea behind this story is to say, well, if they got together and talked about it, then maybe they can come up with some hours that the confectioner would not use his machine. Maybe he can do it at a different time. So that would be preferable to the doctor suing the confectioner. And so he can't use his machines anymore because it was disrupting his business. That's actually he kind of came up with a theorem about this. So if transaction costs are low, transaction costs being something that can, some sort of cost that can get in the way of transactions, such as research costs, as actual physical costs or research costs, any sort of cost that you can incur through the process of coming to some sort of an agreement. If transaction costs are low, private bargaining will result in an efficient solution to the problem of externalities. Okay, so that's another way we can come up with a solution to externalities. A third way, and I say this is way 2.5 because in this particular case it'd be tough to see this actually occurring, but mergers, right? So again, the problem with some of these externalities or all these externalities is that we don't have internalizing the costs and benefits that we're incurring on others. But what if we did? So in this particular example, let's say this industrial waste company buys this fishery downstream. If it did, then it would incur the cost of its own pollution on this other business. And so it would reduce its pollution accordingly to maximize its overall profit function. It's internalizing the costs that it's having on this fisherman. Okay, now the problem with that is, why would this industrial waste company buy this fishery downstream of its own pollution? Okay, that may not be a great example, but it would solve the problem if it did occur. Okay, all right, so let's kind of skip to the end here. So basically what I want you to get from these 3 externality lectures that I put up are, why are these market failures occurring? What effects do they have on welfare? So we're looking at deadweight loss from either potential welfare we could be getting, or some kind of a negative welfare from producing too much. How do we fix these inefficiencies? So taxes, if they are negative externalities, we want to produce less, or subsidies for positive externalities, we want to produce more. And also, what are some problems associated with the solutions? This is what we just went over, okay? All right, so that's pretty much it for externalities. Thanks again, and please send me an email if you have any questions. Thank you.